Hello everyone, it's me, Giles with a J, the person who personally narrates this channel. Just remember, that will never change. We're on season 21 and the theme is strange and unusual, so if you have any suggestions that fit that theme, leave them in the comments. Otherwise, if you enjoy the show, slap that subscribe button, uppercut the like button, and turn on notifications. I post new episodes twice a week, a long episode every Monday and a shorter episode every Thursday. Now, on to the show. On November 16, 1961, a cargo ship was cruising through the North Providence Channel in the Bahamas on its way to Houston, Texas, when the second officer saw a small speck of white out in the water. As the ship got closer to the object, it became clear that it was a tiny life raft, and on the raft was a young blonde girl. The girl, sunburned and emaciated, was pulled aboard the ship as sharks were circling her raft. The captain tried to get information out of her, but she was in no shape to answer questions. All she could do was say the word Belle in a raspy voice before the crew contacted the U.S. Coast Guard to report the discovery. Authorities immediately recognized the name Belle as they were already investigating the situation. Just 3 days prior, another person had been found floating in the waters around the Bahamas. Julian Harvey had been rescued, and the story he told about an accident that sank the ship he was the captain of, the Belle, and killed everyone else on board was about to unravel. This is Monsters. Arthur Duperrault was born in 1921 and grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. He was the president of his high school class in 1939 and went on to college right after, but he dropped out and joined the service when World War II broke out. Arthur joined the United States Navy, and after training he was sent to Southeast Asia where he worked as a medical corpsman in Burma. It was his time in the Navy where he developed a love of the open ocean. He was an experienced sailor back home where he sailed on Lake Superior, but even being on one of the largest lakes in the world was no comparison to the ocean. After transfers to Washington, D.C. and then China, Arthur was sent to work at the Pentagon in 1944. That was where he met a woman named Jean Brosh, who worked as a secretary at the FBI headquarters. Within months, the two were married, and the following year Arthur was discharged from the Navy. Jean was born on July 16, 1923 and had grown up in Madison, Nebraska. When Arthur left the service, the couple moved back to Green Bay and Arthur continued his college education. Their first child, a son named Brian, was born on October 27, 1947, and Arthur graduated from the Northern Illinois College of Optometry in 1949. From there, Arthur set up a practice in Green Bay, which became extremely successful. The Duperraults welcomed their second child, a daughter named Terry Jo, on February 7, 1950, and their third and final child, another daughter named Renee, on August 6, 1954. The family lived in a house on an acre of land right by the local golf club. The whole family was athletic and loved the outdoors. Arthur often talked about his time in the service and how much he loved the adventure of it. He believed that travel was the best way to learn about the world and wanted his family to have similar adventures. In 1960, Arthur realized that he had become so busy with work that he was becoming disconnected from his family. He had dreamt of taking his family on a months-long sailing trip around the world, something that would be the adventure of a lifetime and a way for the family to really spend some quality time together. But he knew he needed to start small. He planned to hire someone to sail them through the Bahamas for a week, and if it went well, they would extend the trip. Arthur found someone to take over his optometry practice for that time. They pulled the kids out of school, and at the beginning of November of 1961, they headed down to Florida. In Fort Lauderdale, they boarded the Belle, a 60-foot or 18-meter two-sail ketch. It was a coincidence that the boat had been built in Wisconsin, where the Duperraults had traveled from. It sailed the Great Lakes before being sold and moved to the Florida coast. It had been a racing boat, so the hull was on the narrower side, but it was big enough to house the Duperrault family as well as the man they had hired to captain the ship and his wife. The main cabin had seating, a small kitchen, and a bathroom with a toilet and shower. There was a larger and smaller bedroom off of the main cabin, which would be where the Duperraults would sleep. There was another smaller cabin that had a separate access door on the front deck of the ship. That was the crew quarters. Julian Harvey was born on March 1st, 1917 in New York State. He grew up in Scarsdale and started working as a model for the John Roberts Powers Agency. He then joined the United States Air Force, where he became a pilot. He was part of the 93rd Bomb Group, who were active in North Africa during World War II. He flew 29 combat missions during that war and went on to fly 114 missions in the Korean War. He retired from the Air Force in 1958 with the rank of major and moved to Fort Lauderdale to chase his dream of becoming a sailboat captain. He was an attractive man who did well with the ladies, having married 6 times by 1961. In 1949, while he was still in the service, he was driving a car with his second wife and her mother when it skidded out of control and went over the side of a bridge. Both his wife and mother-in-law were killed, but he had somehow managed to jump from the vehicle before it left the bridge. Authorities were suspicious of the accident, obviously, but the investigation didn't turn up any evidence of wrongdoing. Julian collected a good-sized insurance payout from the accident. Over the years, he also collected insurance payouts from 2 boats he owned that sank, also under suspicious circumstances. Julian married his 6th wife, Mary Dean Jordan, who went by Dean, on July 26, 1961, about 3 months before the Belle would set sail with the Duperraults on board. Dean was a former flight attendant who, in another coincidental twist of fate, had previously lived in Wisconsin. In 1961, Arthur had chartered the Belle from its owner, Harold Pegg. Harold hired Julian to captain the ship, and on November 8th, the 5 members of the Duperrault set sail with 44-year-old Julian and 34-year-old Dean. At the time, Arthur was 40 years old, Jean was 38, Brian was 14, Terry Jo was 11, and Renee was 7. The ship was stocked for a week's trip around the islands, and as they pulled away from the dock, David was on the deck of the ship with a .22 caliber rifle, excited at the prospect of shooting at sharks. Julian set a southeastern course and headed for the first stop on the trip, Bimini. The Bahamas is a chain of around 700 islands and 2,400 keys in the North Atlantic Ocean, southeast of Florida and north of Cuba. Bimini is the westernmost island, just 55 miles or 88 kilometers directly east of Miami. In 1961, Bimini was one of the most famous areas in the world for big game fishing. Today it's home to the Bimini Biological Field Station Foundation, also referred to as the Shark Lab, where some of the top marine biologists study the ocean's ecosystem. Due to a storm, the journey took longer than expected, and the Belle didn't arrive until after the customs office had closed, so they spent the night on the ship anchored offshore. The next morning, the family was up early watching pelicans search for fish in the clear water. They watched a large tuna swim underneath the ship. Instead of taking the dinghy to shore to present papers to the customs office, Julian took the ship north under engine power until they reached Great Isaac Key. It's a tiny speck of land that's barely visible even if you zoom all the way in on a map. It's home to an old lighthouse that's there to warn sailors of the dangerous shoals around the key. It's not known if the family went to the island and explored the beach. After a night off the shore of the key, Julian sailed the ship east through the Northwest Providence Channel toward Great Abaco Island. That journey gave the Midwestern family a show like they never could have imagined. Fish jumped from the water while porpoises swam around the boat, breaching the surface as they played with each other. A sea turtle appeared on the surface at one point, and at another, the fin of a shark could be seen cutting through the water. The ship's next stop was near Sandy Point at the southernmost tip of Great Abaco Island. The family spent the next few days moving around to different spots near the shore, snorkeling, viewing tropical fish, and underwater gardens. They did some spear fishing and played on the beach, collecting seashells and building sandcastles. The Duperraults, along with Julian, went into the town on Sandy Point. It was the first time they had ventured farther onto land, having spent their previous days either on the ship, in the water, or just on the beach. Julian went to the local commissioner's office to register their entry into the Bahamas, which was technically late, but the government was fairly relaxed about it. While in the office, Arthur gushed about how much he and his family loved the area and talked about building a winter home right there in Sandy Point. The Duperraults explored the town, purchased souvenirs, and mailed some letters. Julian refilled the ship's supply of fresh water, and while in town, he ran into an old acquaintance who he invited onto the Belle for dinner. On November 12th, Arthur and Julian returned to the commissioner's office to submit the paperwork required to leave the Bahamas. That evening, a local fisherman joined them for dinner, and he said everyone on the ship was in good spirits as they celebrated before their departure from the island. On November 13, 1961, an oil tanker named the Gulf Lion spotted a small dinghy floating in the Northwest Providence Channel, towing an even smaller life raft behind it. It was noted that at first it didn't seem like the man in the dinghy was trying to get their attention, but as the ship turned to approach, the man began waving. Once they were close enough, the man yelled, quote, "My name is Julian Harvey. I am master of the ketch Belle. I have a dead baby here. I think her name is Terry Jo Duperrault." In the raft being towed by the dinghy was the lifeless body of a small girl, but it wasn't Terry. It was 7-year-old Renee. After being pulled onto the tanker, he explained that his ship had been damaged in a storm the night before and he was the sole survivor. He had managed to get the dinghy and life raft into the water, but the others were trapped inside the ship. It was later that he found Renee floating face down in the water and he pulled her onto the raft. The Coast Guard was immediately notified as the lost ship was an American vessel, and then they took Julian and Renee's remains to Nassau. That's the capital of the Bahamas, located in New Providence Island, just south of where the dinghy was found. From there, Julian flew to Miami, where he was ordered to attend a formal inquiry regarding the accident. In the meantime, the Coast Guard launched an extensive search of the area around where the ship had gone down, but were unable to locate any wreckage or survivors. On November 16th, Julian arrived at the office of Lieutenant Ernest Murdoch to answer questions about the loss of the Belle and the deaths of its passengers. It was immediately noticed that he seemed in good spirits despite what had happened mere days prior, which also included the death of his wife. Before the inquiry began, Julian asked how the search was going, and the lieutenant told him that they hadn't found anything. Soon, Julian was placed under oath and asked what had happened that caused the Belle to sink and kill the Duperraults and his wife. Julian's story is as follows, taken from the transcript of his testimony. They left Sandy Point the evening of November 12th with the plan of sailing for 2 days back to Florida. They were going to stop a couple of times for short breaks, the first of which was going to be near Great Stirrup Key, about a quarter of the way back. They weren't far from the key when they hit a squall and suddenly the main mast broke about a third of the way up. It dropped straight down and punched through the deck and the hull. That caused the lines to pull on the mizzen mast, which also broke and came down onto the cockpit. At that point, Arthur and Dean had been cut on their legs by splintered wood, but everyone else was uninjured. Julian started the engine and had it push them slowly to help control the ship. As he was retrieving some cutters so he could cut the cables that were then tangled on the ship's deck, the engine caught fire. The passengers had all gone to the rear of the ship to escape the flames, and Julian retrieved 2 fire extinguishers to use them on the fire, but they didn't help. It was then that he launched the dinghy and the life raft. While he was doing that, the passengers jumped into the water, but by the time he had come around with the dinghy, he said he couldn't find them. He said it was dark and that he had a carbide lamp, but that it didn't work, so he threw it overboard. A carbide lamp burns acetylene, which is made by a chemical reaction of calcium carbide and water. He claimed to have yelled until he was hoarse but didn't get a response. Eventually, he found Renee's body floating in the water and he pulled her onto the raft. Julian said he tried artificial respirations but was unsuccessful. It was at about 1 p.m. the following day that he was seen by the Gulf Lion and was rescued. Despite there being no reason to believe that anything nefarious had happened on the Bluebelle that night, Lieutenant Murdoch was suspicious. It was unlikely that a mast would break and come straight down to puncture the hull of a ship, especially with the wind of the squall pushing it around. If the ship was on fire, why didn't the lookout at the lighthouse on Great Stirrup Key see it on such a dark night? And why wouldn't an experienced sailor navigate the dinghy to the key that was supposedly only a few miles away instead of ending up further south where he claimed he was worried about being caught in the Gulf Stream and taken out into the North Atlantic? The first question that the lieutenant asked was if Julian had attempted to call for help. He said the antenna was taken out when the main mast went down, so he knew it wouldn't work. He was asked if he had flares, and he said yes and admitted that he just didn't think of them at the time. It was another statement that Murdoch found to be suspicious. Same with Julian's explanation as to why he never raised the sail in the dinghy, saying at first it was too windy, and the next morning he was afraid that someone would see the boat and assume it was just sailing and not in need of rescue. The lieutenant was still confused as to how an experienced sailor could make some of the mistakes that Julian had, but anything can happen during an emergency situation, so they released him and prepared to move on to question the owner of the Bluebelle, Harold Pegg. Before they could start, though, someone came into the office to inform Lieutenant Murdoch that Terry Jo Duperrault had been rescued from the waters around the Bahamas. On November 16th, a freighter named Captain Theo was traveling through the Northwest Providence Channel on its way to Houston, Texas, when the second officer noticed a small white spot in the distance that looked out of place. As they got closer, he thought it looked like a small fishing boat, which shouldn't be out that far in the waters, so he informed the captain and they diverted the ship toward the object. Once they were close enough, they realized that it wasn't a boat at all. It was an oval life raft with a young girl sitting on it. Crew members rushed to get down to her and rescue her from the deteriorating raft, which was being circled by sharks. Once on the freighter, Terry collapsed. Her skin was burned and her lips were dry. They placed her in one of the bunks and slowly gave her sips of water and orange juice. The captain asked her name so he could report her rescue to the Coast Guard, but the girl just barely said the word Bluebelle. With the captain still asking about her family and offering to send help, she finally whispered her name before losing consciousness. The captain sent a telegram to the Coast Guard that read, quote, "Picked up blonde girl, brown eyes from small white raft, suffering exposure and shock. Named Terry Jo Duperrault. Was on Bluebelle." The Coast Guard responded with instructions that a helicopter would rendezvous with the ship to pick up the castaway and asked more details about their location and the weather conditions. They could use the information to better calculate where the Bluebelle had gone down so they could search for debris or survivors. That effort did not result in any findings, but the Coast Guard was able to retrieve the raft that Terry had been on. It was an oval of canvas-covered cork with netting in the center. It measured about 2.5 feet wide by 5 feet long, or 3/4 of a meter by 1.5 meters. She had been on the raft in the open waters for 4 days without food or water. It was just about the maximum any human being could go without water, and her recovery happened just in time to save her life. It would be a long and difficult journey for the young girl, though. More questions arose in regard to Julian's story of what happened the night the Bluebelle sank. Based on his story, it seemed unlikely that Terry would have been able to retrieve the life raft she was on. Also, when he was rescued, he said he was positive that the other passengers on the ship had died and didn't press for an immediate search. But if Terry had been able to get to the life raft, that meant he shouldn't have been so certain everyone was dead. If he had pressed for an immediate search of the area where he was found, Terry would have likely been found then, as it was estimated that she would have been about a mile east of him at that time. When Julian heard the news of Terry's rescue, he played it cool but soon left the lieutenant's office, despite it having been beneficial for him to have stayed for the rest of the inquiry. In Miami's Mercy Hospital, Terry remained in a coma for 2 days with fluids being pushed into her system. When she awoke on the second day, she was still unable to tell her story. She was almost fully rehydrated and given small bites of eggs and turkey in order for her body to not reject the food after having gone so long without it. It wasn't until Terry was back on a regular diet and the doctor felt like she was strong enough to relive her ordeal that she was able to be questioned by the Coast Guard. By then, Terry was the only person left alive from the Bluebelle, and investigators were eager to get her story. Not only did Julian's story leave Lieutenant Murdoch with more questions, but he was no longer available to answer them. At about 11 a.m. on November 17th, the day after Julian was questioned in the Coast Guard inquiry, a maid at the Sandman Motel in Miami entered room 17, which was registered to a man named John Monroe. The inside of the room was comfortable, with the air conditioner blowing cool air. There was a faint smell that was odd, but the maid was used to experience various smells from the different people who stayed in the rooms, so she shrugged it off. The room had 2 twin beds, one was untouched and the other had clearly been slept in. As the maid pulled the sheets off the mattress, she noticed a spot of blood on one of them. It's not unheard of for someone to get injured and bleed onto the sheets or a towel in the room, so the maid continued with her duties. As she tried to enter the bathroom, though, she wasn't able to open the door. It wasn't locked, there was just something in front of it that was keeping it from opening. It was then that she realized the smell of blood and she rushed to get the motel manager, but he wasn't able to get the door open either. That's when he called the police. When an officer arrived just after noon, he was able to force the door open enough to put his head inside, where he saw a body lying on the floor, covered in blood. Before becoming an officer with the Miami Police Department, he had worked for Miami Harbor Patrol and knew Julian Harvey. As soon as he saw the man's face, he recognized him and called it in. From what investigators could gather, after leaving the inquiry, he got his suitcase out of his car, which was parked on the street, and took a cab to the motel. There he checked into the room using the name John Monroe and was seen walking to his room with his suitcase and a brown paper bag. The bag contained 2 bottles of whiskey, which he drank all of during the remainder of the day. At some point in the early morning hours of the following day, he got out of bed and went to the desk where he wrote a letter to a man named James Boozer. He and James had been in Air Force training together and had remained friends in the years after. Julian retrieved a razor from his belongings and first started cutting himself on the bed, but when blood dripped onto the mattress, he must have had second thoughts. Not about his life, but about ruining the bed. So he went into the bathroom where he set up 2 pictures, one of Dean and the other of his 14-year-old second son, Lance. On the floor of the bathroom, he used the razor to slash his ankles, his wrists, his forearms, his thighs, and both sides of his neck. One of the cuts on his thighs was so deep that bone was visible. By the time his body was discovered, he was completely exsanguinated. When investigators read the letter, Julian had written, quote, "I'm a nervous wreck and just can't continue. I'm going out now. I guess I either don't like life or don't know what to do with it." He went on to instruct his friend to arrange for the family who were watching Lance to formally adopt him. The letter had no mention of the Bluebelle or what had happened the night it sank. The letter was in a sealed envelope, and it seemed he had written, quote, "cremate and bury at sea" on the back, but went back and scribbled out the word cremate and underlined the words bury at sea. When investigators questioned James Boozer, he stated that he believed that Julian ended his life out of the guilt of being responsible for the deaths of the Duperraults and Dean. He went on to tell them that, after Julian had testified at the inquiry, he was with him at the motel and the captain told him a different story. Julian had told him that when the main mast came down, it hit both Arthur and Dean, injuring them badly and knocking them into the water. He said he saw blood and guts on the deck, freaked out and jumped overboard, abandoning the ship. He said the next thing he remembered was pulling Renee, who he had mistaken as Terry at the time, onto the life raft. James said he asked about the fire, but Julian didn't answer. He just went silent and laid down on the bed. Eventually James left, and that was the last time he saw his friend. Though the story didn't answer many questions about the events of November 12th, it did explain why Julian wasn't able to save anyone who was on board the ship. He simply didn't try. But before they could accept Julian's story, investigators still had one more person to talk to: Terry. Terry had spent her days in the hospital in the dark about what the outcome of the Bluebelle incident had been. She knew that some of her family was dead, but she was unaware that Julian had survived, and she didn't know what had happened to her father. As she laid in the bed, she wondered where her father was. She could think back and account for some of the other people on the ship at the time, but she hadn't seen or heard her father as the incident happened and was not sure if he survived. She worried about how she was going to pay for the hospital treatment, how she was going to get back to Wisconsin, and who she would live with. The question was unnecessary since her aunt and uncle had traveled to Miami as soon as they heard the news and were fully intending to take care of the young girl. But she was traumatized, so that wasn't immediately obvious. On top of that, many people, including the doctor who was treating her, offered to adopt her if she was in need of care after she recovered. It was on November 19th that the doctor contacted the Coast Guard and gave them permission to interview Terry the following day. When the investigators arrived at the hospital, Terry had not spoken a word about the Bluebelle. She hadn't told anyone what happened that night or what she believed the status of the other passengers was. Even though there were multiple family members there with her by the 20th, they never dared to ask. They just wanted to give her time to recover. The investigators began by asking Terry about the trip up until the night of November 12th. She told them about the family adventure and said that they had a great time and there were no problems that she was aware of. When they asked what had happened the night of the quote-unquote accident, she clearly and directly told her story into a microphone, so the entire statement was recorded. She said that she went to sleep at about 9 p.m. She slept in a cabin she normally shared with Renee, but she was alone in the cabin when she went to sleep. At some point in the middle of the night, she was woken up by some sort of commotion. She heard her brother Brian screaming, quote, "Help, Daddy, help." After that, he heard what sounded like running and stomping before it suddenly went quiet. She said she sat in the room, too scared to do anything for what she believed was 5 to 10 minutes. One of the most important parts of her story was that there was no storm, no squall, no wind, and no broken mast. None of that ever happened. When she finally got the courage to leave her sleeping cabin, she saw her mother and brother both on the floor of the main cabin in a pool of blood. She somehow managed to accept that her family members had been killed and quietly climbed to the steps that led up to the ship's cockpit. There she saw more blood and what she thought was a knife. Suddenly, Julian appeared and struck her with something and pushed her back down the stairs. He commanded her to get back into her cabin, so she did. She climbed into her bunk and curled up in the corner. After a few minutes, water from the bilges began filling up the floor in her cabin. Despite realizing the boat was sinking, she was unable to move. That fear was elevated when Julian appeared in the doorway and just stared at her while holding what she thought was the .22 caliber rifle they had brought with them. For minutes, he stood there silently before turning and walking away. Then she heard thumping sounds from the deck. When the water reached the top of the mattress, she finally gathered the strength to flee the cabin. On the deck, it was dark out, but a light on the mast, which was still intact, created enough light to see the dinghy and one of the life rafts were in the water next to the ship. Terry called out, quote, "Is the ship sinking?" Julian suddenly appeared and answered yes. Then he handed her a rope and told her to hold on to it. It was the rope to the dinghy, and he wanted to go grab something but didn't want the dinghy to float away from the ship. So, after killing at least some of her family members, intentionally sinking the ship and getting ready to abandon her, he had Terry help him hold the dinghy so it wouldn't drift away. What an asshole. Terry was confused and let the rope just slip out of her hand, so by the time Julian returned, the dinghy was no longer right next to the ship. The captain cried out, quote, "The dinghy's gone," and immediately dove into the water. Terry watched him swim after the dinghy, disappearing into the darkness. She didn't know whether or not he had made it until she was told of his rescue much later. The water was at the deck, and the young girl remembered there was another life raft tied to the side of the main cabin. She raced over, untied it, and released it from the ship. The deck was well below the surface of the water, and she had to wrangle the raft past the sail that was now billowing in the water. She managed to get out into open water without getting tangled up, and she hopped onto the raft, uncertain about her future survival. The investigators asked her again to make it clear that both masts were up and there was no damage to the ship. Then they asked Terry about a fire, and Terry responded that there had not been a fire on the ship. Julian had put provisions into the dinghy to help him survive his journey back to land, but Terry didn't have time for that. It was just her in the shirt and pants she was wearing, sitting on a ring of cork and rope netting. She had no fresh water, no food, and nothing to shelter her from the sun during the day or keep her warm at night. The earth is indifferent. Fire doesn't care if it's keeping you alive with its warmth or burning you to death. Likewise, the sea doesn't care if you're having a fun family adventure or being swallowed up by its vastness. The first night she was drenched by a rainstorm and struggled to cling to the raft as it hit swells. In the darkness, she feared that she would encounter Julian in the dinghy and he would finish her off. When the sun rose the next morning, she was relieved to see that the captain was nowhere in sight, but the feeling of sheer loneliness was overwhelming. Her suffering increased as the sun rose and beat down on her skin. Over the days, 2 parrotfish began following her and pecking at her through the netting, which was starting to deteriorate. At one point, she drifted over a large school of fish and saw barracudas feeding on them. She also assumed that there were sharks in the area, but it's theorized that the rope netting on the raft had soaked up oil from the ship as it was sinking, and the scent acted as a deterrent for most predators. Another day, she was kept company by 2 pilot whales who swam around near her, and she would say their presence was extremely comforting. Hearing their breath as they broke the surface of the water made her feel not alone. Terry said she was able to sleep the second night at sea, and she had dreams of swimming, only to wake up and realize she was in the middle of the ocean. The next day she saw multiple planes fly by. One actually flew back and forth a few times before it decreased its altitude over her. She waved her arms frantically, even taking off her shirt and using it as a flag, but the plane eventually flew away, not to be followed by any type of rescue. That plane was actually searching for survivors of the Belle, but she was too small and they had flown down at the wrong angle to be able to see her. Finding a small raft in a vast sea is nearly impossible. Her only saving grace was the fact that she was floating in a major shipping lane, which was why both she and Julian would ultimately be rescued by passing commercial ships. By the time she was rescued, she had been in the water for 4 days, was delirious and nearly comatose. Days after her first interview, Terry was told that Julian was rescued alive and that he had Renee's body with him. She was told his story, and investigators confirmed again that the details were untrue. She was certain that the masts were up and had even seen the dinghy in the water using the light that was on top of the mast. That light wouldn't have been there if the mast had come down. They tried to get more information about any arguments that might have occurred that caused violence on the ship, but Terry said there weren't any. They asked if she believed that Julian had killed her family, and she said she didn't know. After the second interview, investigators were sure that Julian had killed some of the passengers on the Belle and deliberately sank the ship. The Coast Guard were not the only ones who questioned Julian's story. His friend James Boozer didn't think his story added up, and though Dean's brothers initially supported Julian, they eventually changed their minds and accepted that Terry was telling the truth. They would reveal that Julian had led their sister to believe he was well off, when in reality he was drowning in debt. No pun intended. A friend had told Dean's brothers that Julian had suggested he get a plane, Julian could crash it and survive the quote-unquote accident, and they could collect the insurance money. Then there were the other boats that Julian had owned that had sank and left him with an insurance payout. During their investigation, the Coast Guard learned that the Belle's engine had a state-of-the-art fire suppression system that would have put out a fire almost immediately. They also learned that many crew members of the Gulf Lion found Julian extremely suspicious. Some claimed to have seen him throw something red overboard before they picked him up. A search of the dinghy showed marks on the back of the boat that would have been made by an outboard motor. The math for how far Julian had made it in one day didn't add up to someone who had just been drifting. Having the life raft with Renee's body on it in tow would have slowed him down if he was using the sail, and the only way he could have gotten as far as he had was if he used a motor. It's believed that he was trying to either get to a specific destination or get farther away to make the location of where the Belle sank harder to find. Once the Gulf Lion began approaching, he unclamped and dropped the engine into the water. Then he had to dump the gasoline out of the gas can, fill it with water, and toss it in so it would sink, taking enough time for the tanker to get close enough for crew members to see. Once aboard the Gulf Lion, he was given fresh clothes which he accepted except for his pants. He refused to change his pants. At the hotel he was at in Nassau, a maid went into his room and saw U.S. cash spread out over the bed drying. Friends told investigators that Julian would sometimes cut the lining in his pants and line them with cash he didn't want others to find. That supported the idea that Julian was trying to make it somewhere specific and then he could use the cash to disappear. The only question then was why he was bringing Renee's body with him. Why wouldn't he have just left it where the ship sank? Some believe that he wanted to hide the body. Terry had seen her mother and brother in the main cabin, but never saw her father, Renee, or Dean before the ship sank. It's believed that Julian had put those bodies in the separate forward cabin so they would be trapped in the ship at the bottom of the water. That way the bodies wouldn't possibly wash ashore. Somehow, Renee made it out of the ship and he brought her with him in order to possibly bury her body wherever he went ashore. It's not clear if she made it to the surface alive or not. An autopsy showed that she had drowned, but whether Julian physically drowned her himself is unknown. He didn't seem to want to kill the younger children himself. He wanted Terry to stay in the cabin so she would go down inside the ship and drown. I think he did the same thing with Renee, but she managed to get out and make it to the surface, or she got out but drowned and he found her body. My theory is that he believed that Renee had drowned in the ship and that the body he had with him he thought was Terry. Since she was on the deck when he jumped in to catch the dinghy, he thought she was the only passenger who had a chance of washing ashore. So when he found a body in the water, he pulled it onto the life raft and assumed it was Terry. That's why he called Renee Terry when he was picked up by the Gulf Lion. That leaves the question of why Julian killed everyone to begin with, and again, we only have theories, but the one that's backed up by some evidence is that he did it for money. Investigators learned that just before taking off on the Belle, Julian had taken out a $20,000 life insurance policy on his wife Dean. The policy had a double indemnity clause in the event she died in an accident, so Dean dying in a sailing accident would have paid Julian $40,000 or over $400,000 today. The Belle's owner, Harold Pegg, testified that he had seen scratches on Julian's arm after the incident, and the captain said he got them from the rigging, which according to him was all over the deck after the mast had come down. But Harold said it didn't look like scratches from rigging. He thought they looked like scratches from fingernails, and he remembered that Dean had long fingernails. That became more plausible once it was learned that the mast hadn't come down, so Julian wouldn't have been struggling to get around the rigging. One popular theory is that Julian only intended to kill his wife for insurance money. In the dark of night, he was going to kill her and dump her overboard, which in true Julian Harvey fashion, he would claim was an accident. Dean fought back and the commotion alerted someone else on the ship, likely 14-year-old Brian, who called for his father's help. That caused Julian to go into a frenzy, killing the adults and Brian and planning to sink the ship and flee in the dinghy. It's easy to see why people want to believe that, as it makes Julian seem like less of a monster as he didn't pre-plan the murder of an entire family, but that theory also leaves questions. Why would he have been okay dumping Dean's body in the water where it could eventually wash ashore and become evidence when he clearly took steps to make sure the bodies on the ship were trapped inside various cabins? Maybe he was planning to weigh her down with something. Why would he have been hiding cash in his pants? If he was going to return to Miami as a grieving widower and collect insurance, what was the cash for? Though his friends said he kept money in his pants other times, so maybe he always had it there just in case. Though it's clear that Julian had a hand in the deaths of 5 people in the sinking of the Belle, his reason and plan will never be known, as he left the world without answering those questions. The idea of searching for the wreckage to check for damage to masts, fire damage, and locate bodies has been discussed but never carried out. Terry went back to Wisconsin and lived with family members. A year after the incident, she changed her name from being spelt Terry to being spelt Tere to disconnect herself from stories about poor little Terry Jo. In 1999, she was re-interviewed after having sodium amytal administered, and she recalled the events of the night almost the same, but with more clarity. She said she was sure it had been a knife she had seen on the deck that night, and that Julian was definitely holding the rifle when he was standing in the doorway of the cabin. She also said that she recalled seeing Julian on the deck with a gas can, which was a new detail and matched the idea that there was an outboard motor on the dinghy. Terry remained quiet about the incident for a long time and never received any trauma counseling. She would be married multiple times and have 3 children, wanting to be known as someone who was strong and able to carry on with her life and not as the poor girl who was orphaned at sea. She and a psychiatrist co-authored a book called Alone, Orphaned by the Ocean in 2010, and also went on the Today Show where she talked about her ordeal. Though we might never know exactly why Julian did what he did out at sea in November of 1961, there is at least enough evidence to place him on our list of monsters. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave a comment. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.